Before capitalism, before corporations, before the idea of a job even existed, there was a system so elegant in its brutality that it controlled Europe for nearly 1,000 years. It wasn't built on money, it wasn't built on markets. It was built on something far more fundamental: land, loyalty, and the acceptance that your birth determined everything. This was feudalism, and understanding how it worked explains why the modern world looks nothing like it. Welcome to the Money Historian, where money, power, and history collide. And nothing is ever as simple as it looks. When we think about medieval Europe, we imagine castles and knights, plagues, and crusades. But beneath all that drama was an economic machine that somehow kept millions of people alive. Despite having almost none of the tools we take for granted today, no banks, no stock markets, no currency flowing through the economy, no concept of economic growth, feudalism wasn't designed to make people rich, it was designed to make them survive. And for centuries it worked precisely because it locked everyone into a rigid hierarchy where movement was almost impossible. Here's how the system actually functioned. At the top sat the king, who theoretically owned all the land in the kingdom, but a king can't personally manage millions of acres. So he distributed chunks of territory to his most powerful supporters, the nobles, the lords, the barons. This wasn't a gift, it was a contract. In exchange for land, these nobles owed the king military service, taxes, and political loyalty. They became vassals, bound by oaths that carried the weight of sacred obligation. But those nobles couldn't farm the land themselves either, so they subdivided their territories, granting estates to lesser lords and knights in exchange for the same deal: military service, loyalty, and a cut of whatever the land produced. This created a cascading hierarchy of obligation, a pyramid of vassalage, where everyone owed something to someone above them. Land flowed down, service flowed up, and at the very bottom, holding up the entire structure with their labor, were the peasants. The peasants, or serfs, as most of them were called, had no ownership. They were tied to the land, legally bound to work the estate they were born on. They couldn't leave without permission. They couldn't sell their labor to the highest bidder. They couldn't aspire to something better. In exchange for protection and a small plot to farm for themselves, they worked the lord's fields, paid rent in crops or labor, and handed over a portion of everything they produced. If that sounds like slavery with extra steps, that's because it basically was, except the lord had certain obligations too. He had to protect them from bandits, provide justice in disputes, and theoretically ensure they didn't starve during bad harvests. Now, here's the critical part. This entire system ran without money. Medieval Europe had coinage, but most people never touched it. The economy operated on goods and services, not currency. A peasant paid rent with grain, eggs, chickens, or days of labor. A knight received land, not a salary. A lord collected taxes and produce, not cash. Even international trade was often conducted through barter or credit arrangements that wouldn't be settled for years. Money existed, but it was scarce, hoarded by the wealthy, and irrelevant to daily survival for most people. This wasn't a bug, it was a feature. Without money circulating through the economy, there was no way to accumulate liquid wealth and escape your station. A peasant couldn't save up coins and buy freedom. A merchant couldn't outbid the nobility for land. Wealth was locked into physical assets: land, livestock, grain stores, and those assets were tied to the feudal hierarchy. Social mobility was almost non-existent because economic mobility was structurally impossible. But the system had a genius to it. Feudalism created a self-sustaining economic model in a world where long-distance trade had collapsed, where cities had shrunk to villages, where literacy had nearly vanished, and where the Roman Empire's infrastructure was crumbling into ruin. After Rome fell in the 5th century, Europe fragmented into thousands of tiny, isolated communities. There was no central authority, no police force, no legal system that extended beyond the local lord's estate. Feudalism filled that void by creating localized, self-sufficient economic units: the manor. Each manor was its own miniature economy. The lord's estate produced grain, vegetables, meat, wool, leather, tools, clothing, everything needed for survival. Peasants farmed the fields, blacksmiths forged tools, millers ground grain, bakers baked bread. Every role was specialized, every person had a function, and every output stayed within the community. There was no surplus production aimed at distant markets because there were no distant markets. The goal wasn't profit, it was subsistence. And this is where feudalism reveals its deepest logic. It was a system designed for stagnation, not growth. Economic expansion requires surplus, investment, innovation, and risk-taking. Feudalism had none of these. Lords consumed what their estates produced. Peasants lived harvest to harvest. There was no incentive to improve productivity because any surplus would just be taken by the lord. There was no reason to innovate because tradition dictated every aspect of farming, and deviation was punished. The entire system was optimized for stability, not progress. But stability came at a cost. Feudalism trapped people in poverty by design. A serf worked the same land their grandparents worked, using the same tools, growing the same crops, living in the same hut, and dying at roughly the same age. Generation after generation, nothing changed. The nobility lived better, but even they were constrained. Their wealth was land, and land couldn't be easily converted into other forms of power without breaking the feudal contract. Then, slowly, cracks began to appear. The Black Death in the 14th century killed a third of Europe's population, and suddenly labor was scarce. Peasants had leverage for the first time in centuries. Lords had to offer better terms to keep workers from fleeing. Wages rose, serfdom weakened. Around the same time, long-distance trade started reviving. Italian city-states like Venice and Genoa grew rich on commerce with the East. Banking emerged, currency began circulating again. Merchants who had no land started accumulating more wealth than minor nobility. The feudal hierarchy couldn't adapt to this. A system built on fixed obligations, inherited status, and local self-sufficiency couldn't compete with the flexibility of money, markets, and mobile capital. As towns grew and trade expanded, people started escaping the manors. City air makes you free became a medieval saying. If a serf could reach a town and live there for a year and a day, they were legally free. Feudalism was being undermined not by revolution, but by economic evolution. By the 15th and 16th centuries, feudalism was dying. Monarchs consolidated power and began taxing in currency, not goods. Standing armies replaced feudal levies. Land became a commodity that could be bought and sold. Wage labor replaced serfdom, and capitalism built on private property, free labor, and market exchange started taking over. The transition was brutal and took centuries, but the direction was irreversible. Feudalism couldn't survive the rise of money. And here's the uncomfortable truth. Feudalism didn't disappear because people realized it was unjust. It disappeared because it became economically inefficient. As long as Europe was poor, fragmented, and isolated, feudalism made sense. It provided order, security, and survival in a world that offered none of those things naturally. But the moment trade revived, cities grew, and money started flowing again, the entire structure became obsolete. You can't run a commercial economy on barter and hereditary obligation. So what does this mean for us? It means that economic systems aren't permanent. They're solutions to specific problems in specific contexts. Feudalism worked for 1,000 years, not because it was fair, but because it matched the material conditions of post-Roman Europe. When those conditions changed, the system collapsed. And the same will be true for capitalism, or whatever comes next. No economic structure lasts forever. They all adapt or die. But there's a deeper lesson here. Feudalism shows us what happens when economic mobility is deliberately suppressed, when wealth is tied to birth rather than effort, when systems prioritize stability over growth. It's a warning about what rigid hierarchies actually produce: stagnation, inequality, and the slow suffocation of human potential. Feudalism didn't collapse because people fought it. It collapsed because people found ways around it. And that pattern repeats throughout history. The modern world is built on the opposite principle: that anyone can rise, that markets are open, that money is liquid, and that your future isn't determined by your birth. We take that for granted now. But for most of human history, feudalism was the norm, and understanding why it dominated for so long and why it finally died tells us something essential about how economic power actually works. If this gave you a new perspective, hit subscribe. History has the answers. I'll show you where to look.